So first item on the agenda is membership update. Bruce.
Thanks, Chair. Sadly, we've been informed that Barbara Mansfield, who was a governor representative representing Newborough Primary School, has stood down this term from her role as governor, has retired essentially, and that's also meant she's standing down from her role as Schools Forum representative, and obviously we've contacted Barbara and thanked her for her contribution. But again, also delighted to inform Schools Forum that we have a new diocese representative, Ros Cant, who's joined us this morning. Welcome, Ros.
Welcome, Ros.
Okay. Again, we do have vacancies across Schools Forum, so when we reconvene in the autumn term, if using the respective networks, anybody would like to, sort of promote vacancies and put them in touch with me if anybody's interested in joining us, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, just before I move on to apologies for absence, I should have reminded everyone, obviously this is a public meeting and it is being recorded, so in public interest. Okay, apologies for absence, Luke.
We've had apologies from Victoria McLeod, Richard Carr, Sarah Smith, Andrea Mead and Councillor Wearmouth.
Thank you very much. Okay, item 3 is declarations of interest, if any. Just a reminder that if there are any declarations of interest in relation to any specific items, either raise them now or during the item. Thank you. Okay, move on to agenda item 4, which is the minutes and matters arising from the last meeting. And I have to say thank you to Graham Wilkins for stepping in and chairing that meeting in my absence. Thanks. Bruce, minutes and matters arising, is there anything arising?
No. There's nothing specifically if you take it on page by page basis. Page 1, any issues of accuracy or any matters arising. Page 2. I think obviously the bottom of page, so again, in terms of page, bottom of page 2, we're obviously picking up the school grant figure generally. Page 3. Page 4. Page, final page, page 5. So we can agree those as an accurate record of the meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on to item 5. It's a SIPFA communication that Bruce has brought to our attention regarding fixing special educational needs and disabilities finance.
And we've managed to get it down to one page, Chair. Were it that simple. Obviously, there's been a lot of coverage in the press currently around the, SEND finance, which people will be aware of. We are aware that the statutory override has been postponed a further 2 years. But I thought it was worth sharing this paper, and obviously there's a link within the paper for anybody who wants to look at the longer paper that was circulated shortly after the February Schools Forum meeting. Again, highlighting 5 key principles which SIPFA, which again, if anybody's not familiar with SIPFA, it's the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy, highlights 5 key principles in terms of SEND reform, looking again at levels of funding, allocating resources based on actual needs rather than outdated historic formulas, early intervention, establishing a shared understanding of best practice and defining measurable outcomes, coordination between partners, creating a framework for how education, health and care partners work together effectively, market management, fixing the independent placement market to give consistency, quality and value for money, and finally, financial accountability, giving councils greater flexibility to meet needs while ensuring sustainability. Again, I think it was interesting just to see, certainly from SIPFA's perspective, that it was a macro problem needing to be fixed in terms of through central government policy predominantly, although clearly local government will be key partners in that. Again, happy to take any questions, happy to give any clarification if there's anything arising. again, for anybody with a particular interest, the report is eminently readable. I think it runs to about 30 pages if anybody has the opportunity or the desire to look at it through the link.
David?
Just a note, just a comment or two really on the paper. It's obviously welcomed, and I think the detail of it is pretty clear and straightforward. But many on the forum, I think, will also recognise that where possible, we've taken a good number of steps included within this paper already. It's not that this necessarily, I don't think, you're not going to read this and go, oh, blimey, that's really new. That's exactly what I thought. You know, that's where we should be moving on to. So, you know, the early intervention, coordination between partners, market management have been drivers for a lot of the sector. So this is right across education, health and social care. You know, it's a part of everybody's working lives on a daily basis. Some of the bits that we don't have quite so much control over is the global level of funding. So that's the first bullet point, and I think it's appropriate that it is the first bullet point in this paper. And I would suggest that our financial accountability is in line with, but I'm always, I think we would all welcome giving Schools Forum more flexibility to give advice to council on further steps going forwards. So the comment is, I think you will recognise when you read through the steps that we've been taken, the bit of the sticking point is that first bullet point is the global level of funding, but we're always looking to improve anyway.
Okay, thanks, David. Obviously, we are anticipating the government white paper on SEND funding, which I've no doubt will form the main item of business in at least one of the high needs subgroup meetings. Okay, if we move on to item 6, which is the DSG outturn, which is pages 11 to 18 in your agenda pack, and Callum, you're going to take that.
So, all year we have now predicted that the DSG for NCC would go into deficit, and this is essentially the confirmation of us doing that. It's the outturn report. It will look at the implications of the outturn and the anticipated future pressures alongside. As we are now in deficit through the DSG, it is asked for Schools Forum to note that there are no carry forwards for the respective DSG blocks, because you cannot hold carry forwards in an unusable reserve. When we get further down, we've got a couple of graphs and visuals to kind of to show the position and the reason why. There are illustrative tables which do break down the different blocks. It is just illustrative because it gets reported as a bottom line. Okay. So, bit of background first. During the January and February 2024 meetings, the budget for each block within the dedicated schools block discussed and finalised. The DSG allocation was then updated by the DFE in March, and consequently future allocations in the budget shift alongside that. We are still awaiting the final allocation for 24-25. What that final allocation does is it adjusts the early years block. We have made an estimate for that adjustment, but it will not affect anything that hits 2024-25. Any adjustments will then be felt in 25-26. We came into 24-25 on the back of a £1.159 million surplus in 23-24. This was drawn into the plan, into the year, and ultimately the DSG ended with an £8.052 million overdraw or deficit. Provisions in the early years, the school and early years finance regulations direct that local authorities are required to carry forward overspends separately to usable reserves, hence why they are put in an unusable reserve. What this essentially does is holds it separately from the general fund balance, so it doesn't have an overall effect on the council's viability, essentially. This is the in-year breakdown for the dedicated schools block. We have broken it into the 4 blocks being central, early years, high needs and schools. We can see there quite illustrative on the right hand side just how much of a weighting the high needs block has on the overall dedicated schools block in terms of the outturn position. We'll have slight overspend on the central schools block of 0.79 and underspends on the early years block and the schools block, and then a heavy 9.187 overspend on the high needs block. This table is introducing any of the reserves, so that 1.159 is embedded in here, which essentially bumps up, it betters our position by 1.159 million essentially, but we are still showing at 8.052 overspend on DSG. Reasons for the overspend, so I've grouped the relatively minor ones together. Within the central schools block, the overspend is mainly due to actually a rise in social care and EHCP placements, where we have to, if the children do not have an EHCP, then the education element of their independent school placements hits the central schools block rather than the high needs block. We have 5 residential placements and looked after children, and 8 additional placements attending Longridge Towers. There's a slight underspend on the admissions team of 0.01 billion due to vacant posts partway through the year, and the working with schools budget had a 0.024 million underspend as consultant works were reduced as part of the redevelopment projects. The early years block was underspent by 0.624 million. This is largely because of using grants to pick up as much as we possibly can from the central expenditure. So we have used the wraparound grant to fulfill any overheads to minimise the impact then on the DSG, to enable us actually to put the pass-through rate to our nurseries and provisions to this year to 98.3%. It is higher than it's ever been, and we're trying to pass through as much as that early year funding onto the providers. It is worth noting that the DFE mandate pass-through rate is 96%, so we are passing through more funding than the DFE actually, than is the minimum set out by the DFE. There was a slight underspend on the SEN Inclusion Fund, where actually, contrary to a lot of the high needs block, a lot of early years pupils weren't identified to be funded through the Inclusion Fund, which generated a 0.073 million pound under. The schools block was underspent by 0.59 million pound, due to, in part, the trade union facility time balance. Now, historically, these balances have been requested to be carried forward and held in reserve. That isn't possible for the reasons that I've already outlined in unusable reserve. So any balances on trade union and English as additional language services are now drawn into the overall balance of the DSG rather than sitting in the reserve. Similar for the school contingency budget, where we are anticipating that what was the balance there will still essentially be spent as part of the Berwick Coquet redevelopments and Seaton Valley, obviously. But whilst we expect that expenditure to hit, we cannot formally put it in reserve and draw it out of reserve because it is now unusable. Let's go on to the main draw. So our high needs block. Our AOTAS service had a 0.162 million underspend, which was in large driven by pupil transport costs and changing the way we procure and the operational strategy of transport within AOTAS. The remaining underspend was due to overachievement of income reclaimed through ORPU and high needs funding through to academies. Across the low incidence team, the high incidence team, and the central services, we renegotiated with the NHS some of the posts that they were funding to include historic pay awards, resulting in additional grant to the services, as well as vacant posts through the year, which have now been filled. This accumulation comes to 0.321 million underspend. Again, these negate some of the growth in the EHCPs and the top-up values, but not all. Independent school budget was overspent by 0.624 million. By the end of the year, there were 30 children with educational element to their placements with EHCPs. Now, the number that have been placed in external residential placements in social care has increased by approximately 35% in 24-25, and due to the rising demand and internal placements reaching capacity in Northumberland and profound complex needs of the children. The education element of these placements is expensive, and it places a large burden on the high needs block. If the children have EHCPs, it creates a burden on the central schools block if they do not. Whilst we're seeing the EHCP growth for education, we are seeing high levels of growth within social care, which also contribute to this. We'll have plans in place going forward to try and reduce and mitigate this growth. So we expect this over the longer term to come down as we look to place internally as much as we can. There's significant £8.671 million overspend in top-ups. This stems from a 22.49% growth in EHCPs in 24-25. That follows a 21.66% growth in 23-24, and that follows a 21% growth in 22-23. We've discussed this all year. We can see the growth, how high that level of growth is. We're now over 4,100 EHCPs in the county, and we expect that over the year to rise to around 4,800. The budget was set, bearing in mind we're seeing the growth, the budget was set expecting a £6.1 million overspend. We have exceeded that, and that's because that growth has continued even higher than the previous years. We've got Appendix B, which is a graph which shows all the average top-ups and the average funding levels broken over the EHCPs, and it shows the declining funding, but I will show you that at the end of this presentation. There's an overspend of 0.199 million on notional SEN payments. These are linked to actually more EHCPs staying in mainstream schools, which is a mitigation of the expensive placements, either at special schools or independent schools. However, it comes with the cost of maintaining those places. So additional payments are then made to our schools to hold them places and facilitate keeping them high needs children within the mainstream setting. There's a 0.099 million underspend on personal budgets. Now, we have seen an increase in demand for the personal budget service. However, for 24-25, we reclaimed a lot of the historic amounts that were unspent by families, and particularly on specialist on specialist equipment as well. So this, whilst it looks like an underspend in year, we're expecting that to overspend in 25-26. It is just due to the hard work, quite frankly, of the SEN team and Bruce's team to reclaim funding that went unspent in previous years. There's additional place funding at primary support bases and specialist support bases, which overspent by 0.08 million. And this is additional places that were required as a response to EHCP growth. The development of the SSBs has mitigated large, more expensive growth in special school places and resulted in the revised commissioning model being rolled out to SSBs going forward. It is anticipated that in 25-26, this provision is set to mitigate over £600,000 worth of growth. It's a clear positive, actually. In amongst all of this, it's a clear positive in the way that we're approaching the EHCP growth and building capacity in keeping children as close to their local communities as possible. And that's, in a lot of ways, while I'm talking about the finances, there are a lot of non-financial benefits that we need to acknowledge in our growth of our SSBs and keeping kids as close to home as possible. Finally, on the high needs block, there is a 0.215 million overspend on the inclusion budget. The demand for the service was at its highest, and the number of exclusions across Northumberland growing quickly through the year resulted in additional therapies, professional services, AP and PRU placements. This is purely an illustrative figure, as if we were holding the reserve within each block. What I'm trying to kind of show you here is actually on the next slide, which shows you the overall effect that the high needs block has on dragging the entire DSG essentially into that deficit. What you can note is on here I have the from 22-23 up to the forecast 25-26, where you can clearly see that the overall DSG was in £4.5 million worth of surplus, and due to the growth, as I've already set out, in EHCPs, you can see that high needs block figure dropping 1.8 to 1.8 in deficit to almost £12 million in deficit, to forecast to be around £17 million deficit by the end of 25-26. Should growth continue at the even higher level that we're seeing, we are thinking that could be another 2.7 million on top of that. This graph, although it is a little bit blurry, is showing the mitigations that we're putting in place and how we're trying to battle the overspend and the fundamental structural funding gap that we currently have. It is anticipated that had we not brought in some of the mitigation measures that we had in building up, increasing capacity in special schools, introducing SSBs, and putting specific sort of tailored needs, specialisms to meet those needs in place, that gap would be 43.16% higher actually than what we're seeing now. So a lot of work is going into this mitigation, and it looks, whilst we're in the early stages, that is a 10-year model on our mitigation, and ultimately in 2030-31 we're saying if we had continued on the plan, on the way that we were, we would be seeing 146% more expenditure than funding by that point. Now that's just 1 year. If you think of the cumulative effect of those years, you're talking a lot of money. Primary reason is the EHCP growth trends. Now, I have alluded to the historic percentages, but we'll look forward. At the moment, we're looking at 16.49% increase in EHCPs for 25-26. Positive is that is a drop from the previous 3 years, but we haven't got to September yet, and September is where we feel most of the growth. So we will continue to monitor it closely and adjust our forecasts accordingly. That does mean that we'll be under the 4,800 that I just talked about in terms of EHCPs, and more like 4,600 that we're currently forecasting. In 2022, September, 59.8% of our EHCPs children were going into special schools. Due to the work that we've done in keeping EHCP children closer to home and expanding capacity in mainstream and supporting our mainstream to take on additional high needs children, this burden has dropped to 45% on special schools. That's a big difference. It's a big price mitigation. However, it's that gap that is then being filled by mainstream schools. It's that pressure that's then being put on mainstream schools to essentially be more inclusive and meet the needs closer to home. We'll have on Appendix A the team-by-team breakdown within the table. I've already gone through everything that's kind of on there, or at least the major points. But that is the individual breakdown and shows the overall within the block that overspends. This is the graph that I referred to earlier, which shows the growth firstly in EHCPs from 2,190 to predicted over 4,600 in 25-26. The top up over that time is the next line up. So the average top up in 21-22 is £6,013. That has risen to £6,638. Not a massive rise in the grand scheme of things. It's the two lines above that are the ones that we really need to take note, and that is the funding per EHCP. So what that purple line is essentially showing is that the national funding has not kept up with the growth in EHCPs fundamentally. So we had £17,500 per EHCP for our high needs block in 21-22. We now have 11,800 per EHCP. Yet our expenditure, while we're doing things more efficiently, more effectively, we're building in mainstream, we're targeting specialisms, we have reduced the expenditure per EHCP from around £17,000 to £13,700. That efficiency actually doesn't keep up with the funding difference. we would like to kind of formally acknowledge the outstanding SEND provision completed by our schools, the more inclusivity that we're showing, and the burden that it does place on our mainstream. I will outline again that it is more than the finances. It is profoundly challenging pupils and needs that we have, that we are dealing with, and we've got really good outcomes, and we're building a much better kind of horizon for our children going forward, despite the financial challenges that arise. Do we have any questions associated with any of that?
Councillor Baker.
Yes, I'm just wondering, Callum, obviously thank you very much for going through all that with us. Do you believe we're getting full value for money? And if we're not, is there anything we can do to improve the value that we're getting for our money?
Yes, David, you want to say that one?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the last graph there clearly demonstrates the effectiveness of all the expenditure that's going on. The fact that the average cost or expenditure on learners with an EHC plan has come down over the time period that was demonstrated on the graph definitely indicates that we're making efficiencies. We've had to do that because of the challenging financial circumstances around. I think up until the previous financial year, Northumberland's high needs block was in balance, quite a marked contrast to a lot of the rest of the country. You know, I mean, Callum's presentation there, I think, is one of the best I've seen. I've seen a few from different local authorities in terms of the grip on the finances, in terms of the understanding of exactly where every penny is going, but also that stark outcome of the graph of going, despite the efficiencies made and future efficiencies still to be made, of course, there's always room for improvement, that unfortunately those funding levels haven't kept up with the demand, and therefore the gaps that we've seen a little bit in the last financial year, but certainly the financial year we're reporting on now is getting quite broad. And I also think the mitigations graph was another good demonstration of our plans for the future, again demonstrating that what would have happened if we hadn't made further efficiencies, and therefore I think it led us to something like 146% overspend, which was, you know, just unbelievable really to get to those figures. But the expected is still unfortunately an overspend on the funding available. If we could see an increase in that funding a bit more in line with demand, then I would expect to see our expenditure below income. We do await some central government changes, and we're trying to lobby with that, both as Northumberland and as the North East set of local authorities together.
Sorry, I was going to say, and have you had much room to do that?
We're in probably weekly contact with our North East partners. There's a number of groups where educational leads meet. There are also SEND and inclusion groups that meet as well. And some of that work is sharing the best practice across the North East, of which there's lots. And some of the mitigations we've put in place here are from other local authorities, and some of the mitigations they're putting in place is because of some of the actions we've taken in Northumberland. So we're definitely working that together. We also look forward to seeing white papers and green papers from central government, because it's clearly high on everybody's agenda, understandably so, and we do need to collectively work on some further solutions.
Thank you, David.
Want to add anything?
It was just a final point in terms of the examples, in terms of making savings and delivering value for money solutions. I think the SSBs and the development of the SSBs through Sue and the team are an example of that, specifically around, because while the DSG is a separate specific ring-fence grant, you know, received from government, it has implications for council funding as well. And if we can deliver, you know, as is the mantra, the appropriate educational placements closer to home, transport is a major sort of pressure at the moment, and that means we can, you know, again, hopefully mitigate and reduce some of those, you know, escalating transport costs that the council needs to fund as opposed to met through the DSG. So that's just, you know, one practical example, if you like.
I would also say, taking my chair's hat off and having my day-to-day role, the local authority organised an excellent conference a few weeks ago on SEND, and there was a clear focus throughout the day on strategies to get more from less resources, and that was a really helpful conference. I think that got people thinking about the challenges of the funding situation, but how we can try and provide an even better level of service for those young people, but with less resource, and just thinking about things differently. Graham?
Thank you, Chair. As I'm Chair of High Needs, I think we should have a vote of thanks to our school colleagues, especially those in the mainstream and in our special school, for the excellent work they're doing with the complex cases with children with educational care plans and also on the SEND register. And I think, you know, we should vote very clearly. This is a grateful thanks, because I know in my school the work the SENCO and the staff do is so important. I'm sure right across the board here. So yeah, and to obviously the officers of the council for the work they're doing to try to get the overspent back down to where it was a few years ago.
Thank you, Graham. I think, yeah, it would be good for Schools Forum to feed that back to colleagues working as SENCOs in our special schools about our recognition of the fantastic efforts that they make. Debbie?
Yeah. Okay, sorry. Yeah, thanks for the presentation, Callum. I'm sure it took a lot of time to pull all that information together, and as it has done for the rest of the team over the course of the last while. I'm coming a little bit late to the table, so please excuse my questions if they're a little bit plain and you've covered this already. Unusable reserves, is that the equivalent of clawback from the central government, or where does the unusable reserve go?
So it is held on the council's balance sheet, but it doesn't affect the bottom line of the council. So it has no material effect on the council. It doesn't go anywhere. It is held. So in future, say if we were to add to that, it would just essentially build up that unusable reserve. The unusable reserve is just held as deficit. Otherwise, the council, NCC, would have to fill that gap, if you like. So that would become a burden then on NCC. So it doesn't go anywhere.
So can it be used? It's unusable.
It's a metaphorical pending trade,
Yeah.
because this is a problem that's being faced across all of the local authorities across the country at the moment. And it's essentially, in practice, Debbie, it's a metaphorical pending tray, awaiting greater sort of government guidance around the system itself and around funding for it.
So you're not able to use it. So it's not able to be used. So I'm thinking in terms of the early years underspend specifically. If we're aware that that's going to be the position before the year end, I don't know, some of the other local authorities are able to allocate a notional reimbursement to settings to be able to PVI settings to be able to use up any underspend so that it goes straight to practitioners, and it could be enhanced with SEN requirements or something like that, which other local authorities have actually produced. Is that something that's been considered, or is it not feasible in the situation?
So we have done that before, got to a point in the year and reimbursed early years, because the funding for early years, like, so we still don't know the final outcome for this financial year, because we get our final settlement in July of the following financial year. So there's always needs to be a bit of slack, because often that is a clawback position on the early years block. We have, where there has been surpluses before, increased hourly rates going forwards to higher than any increases in funding. So we certainly had at least 2 years where the rates received by early years was boosted by a previous underspends, and we've also given money back, for SLAs and things like that, actually, where it was able to be funded from elsewhere. The issue, I think, and please, Callum's more better placed than myself to do this, but from my understanding of it, so it's a little bit layman's terms, which might help, is that the whole block, including all the sectors, because it is now in deficit overall, that sweeps up any surpluses that are in the others. So in the past we were able to do that because overall the blocks were in balance and had a positive at the end. But literally this year is the first time I think we've been in deficit, and therefore any ring fencing that was the choice of forum in previous years, we don't get that choice anymore. That's not our decision, the decision is within the regs. Because the whole block is in deficit, we can't ring fence to any individual blocks within, even though we've done that in the past.
And early years provision has been supported through high needs block in the past. I think essentially it's business as usual, but because of the technical accounting sort of issues, nationally, that's obviously why we're just waiting, for sort of further guidance and direction, both through policy, through the SEN white paper, and then the financial implications of that for accounting purposes.
Okay. I mean, the other thing was in relation to the SSBs. Has there been consideration given to SSBs in the early years sector per se? Because there are lots of instances, and I've had experience of this myself, where children can be supported and can function at a different level with the right support right from very early on, and the early identification, etc., is critical in terms of catching dysregulation before it escalates.
Yeah, I'll comment on that. Yes, considerations been given to it, but on balance, we haven't progressed with specific SSBs for within the early years sector. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that actually a lot of the best practice demonstrated in the SSBs across the primary sector are actually firmly based in early years practice, and actually the inherent practice across the early years sector is unbelievably inclusive in its very nature and its core, and every learner with its own individual journey to be taken through that early years curriculum. So it's not seen as higher a demand as there is in other areas, because the curriculum's already well designed for that. The other side to that, though, in terms of early identification, which I think is unbelievably important, is that we have seen quite a marked increase in the number of the percentage of EHCPs in early years, and actually that growth, I think, is reflective of that strong understanding of special educational needs, particularly in early years, and the fact that in itself therefore brings in quite a significant amount of additional funding into the sector. I think if there were individual cases or particular settings that had really high levels of need, I don't think it's off the table, as it were, and each area we've already done, probably about half the county in total now, have been under review in terms of trying to design local solutions for the next 5 years for provision, and certainly early years providers have been invited to engage in those workshops and those discussions, and some of the open thing is and so as a result of what we think is going to happen going forward, and we've got a lot of very good predictive measures about numbers in year groups of different primary needs, that for then the local area to say, actually the solution is, can we have a bit of this and a bit of this and a bit of that, and then that becomes the plan going forwards, actually. So it's been considered. It was deemed not to be as high a demand as in other areas because of the factors I've mentioned, but it's not off the table altogether.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you, David. Any further questions? Graham Atkin?
Yeah, I suppose it was just a point and then a couple of questions. The point is that perhaps with the central government review around SEND that's expected later in the year, we'd be interested to see what comes from that. I think from a schools forum perspective, it would be helpful clearly to take stock of what that is saying and then revisit the mitigations and what that strategy is, and whether there's scope to bring that closer to the fund, have more impact in terms of meeting the funding limitations. I also think there possibly is a bit of work perhaps for Jessica Conway, Mike Finley's successor, almost certainly going on in the background, just to come and report on the kind of value for money question, the way forward in light of the government's guidance, what the strategy looks like, just so that we as Forum have that kind of understanding that that thinking is going on and that there's a strategy emerging. So perhaps a later meeting next year we could have a look at that.
So we're not waiting for the white paper in terms of trying to develop best practice for Northumberland. There's a lot of engagement currently, and I was just talking with Bruce earlier today about future forum agenda items, and the Northumberland collective partnership, so this is health, social care and education's SEND strategy, came to its natural conclusion around now, and there's been development since just before Easter, a number of co-production events taking place to develop the next SEND strategy. Should be able to share that with Forum at the next Forum, Bruce, so is that end of September, October. But a lot of you will be aware of that development anyway, because I've shared it at Nash and other briefings as well. So that high-level strategy will then lead directly into the actions that we need to take.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
The other questions I had, if I may, Chair, is around EOTAS, just at the bottom of page 12. It says there's an underspend. I didn't quite understand the next bit that said driven by more in pupil transport costs. That suggested more spent. I've perhaps misunderstood that. So maybe a point of clarification there. But the two questions are, one, it refers to an overachievement of income through reclaimed OPU and associated high needs fundings from academies. Given the discussion that we had at Nash the other week, I just wondered if that money should be going back to academies, given the relatively poor EOTAS provision, I think, that we've seen and we've discussed. And the second question relating to that is, given the plans to improve EOTAS provision, what's the thinking as to the impact that that will have on the EOTAS overspend or underspend?
Yeah, and come on, I wrote the same thing down with the OTAS when it came through. There's a really simple explanation as to why there's more income coming in, is because there's many more pupils accessing it than there was before. So though we set off in the year with probably setting a budget around 125 learners accessing the provision through the year, it's nearly up to 200. Okay, so hence the OPU that's come back, there's many more learners accessing it, and that would indicate why the transport costs have increased as well, because there is literally more learners attending. We've reviewed the structures in terms of the delivery of that service, as you know, because we had some discussions on that as well. And we're extending the numbers again, 250, possibly even to 300. We've revitalised the building's capacity. So we've got what we think is the right provision in the right places, but also the flexibility to deliver more spaces when we need it. And we've restructured the way the team actually deliver the timetable, so that you know, every learner that accesses the OTAS going forwards will be able to access up to 17.5 hours direct teaching. So it's going to be a completely different service really going forwards. Having said that, even the service that we've had, the feedback from parents in particular around is that there's a lot of comments saying that service has transformed family lives, transformed the young people that attend it. So some of the outcomes there have been particularly strong for as you recognise, some of our most vulnerable young people in Northumberland. But yeah, there's more OPU because there's a lot more attending.
So it may be too simplistic to say that the spend should have matched that increase in demand. Maybe it's a timing issue. And we certainly, from a schools forum perspective, wouldn't want an overspend necessarily, but in terms of a schools and academies perspective, we don't want to see an underspend when we have had concerns about the provision.
Yeah. I mean, High Needs Block does make a significant contribution. It is by far the highest proportion of the income into that service. Isn't the schools paying for the service? is the high needs block supporting it? So that would probably be a debate for Schools Forum to decide if there was going forwards through the expansion, you know, economies of scale, those sorts of things are probably what's led to a slightly positive position now from a budgetary perspective. If those continue into the new service, then probably, yeah, Schools Forum would be a great place to decide whether any of that balance should offset the expenditure from the high needs block globally or undercut the cost of the schools that are accessing the service.
I think it may be a good future agenda item for Schools Forum to have a report on the Otis service and plans for its development in the autumn.
Yeah, no problems.
Audrey, do you still have a question?
Thank you, Chair. I'll try not to say what others have said, because actually that's managed to be swept up. I think the first thing to say is we've got a number of new forum members today. So I'd like to make an offer that this is quite technical and complex financial information. So happy to set up a development session for any members who would like to understand our schools funding and some of the challenges. And actually the area that we're focusing on now is particularly SEND. So you heard Callum talk about the, you know, somewhere between 22 and 24% increase year on year. I think the global stat over the last 4 years is a 92% increase in demand and a 16% increase in funding. So that mirrors that stark gap that you saw where we were getting I think it was £18,000 per pupil, and now it's 11,000 and some there or thereabouts. So I guess around the value for money, I can give the assurance to all members of School Forum and everyone watching that the team, in partnership with schools, with health, with social care, on a daily basis work out what needs to be done. So the papers that are coming out, and I think David mentioned this, we are seeing written in the papers now what we've already done in Northumberland. So that's great for the rest of the country, but we need to be doing more and much more. We're not the only rural county, and so we do work within our counties group across the country and see how they are working, what we can pick up from them. We are very fortunate to be part of a very strong regional set of local authorities who, again, share good practice. We're fortunate to be supported by some additional DFE funding to do that. Without doubt, the recognition for our schools and settings and the work that they do, as well as our alternative provisions, because actually we are keeping more children in provision in school appropriate levels than we have ever done, and meeting the demands of more needs than we have ever done in Northumberland. And I think that needs to be understood against a challenging financial position. So really aware this is public money, public funds, and working out how we get not just best value, but actually make sure the child and their family or care are supported is our absolute primary position. We have to sit, because we are talking about schools, and Bruce and Callum have rightly said, the potential impact this has on wider services. So for our children and within social care, again, sitting under my remit, but in particular our children who are cared for, or any of our care leavers who access the service in school, or otherwise additional training, and you know, the impact on transport, the support infrastructure, that also comes into high needs. And the team, and Callum's an extended part of the education team, although he's finance, but he does spend all of his time working with us. The detail around that is crawled over forensically routinely, and we look at that particularly around how we can improve all of those services, because without this level of forensic focus, it does have the potential to have an impact on the wider NCC budget. I hope that as forum members, you are getting a sense of the depth of understanding from the officer team here around how we spend this money, and actually our schools and our settings understand their own budgets as well. So they work with us, and I'm saying us, it is the team here and broader teams who are not in the chamber today on a daily basis focusing on this. So the pop-up challenges that we deal with routinely, and I know we're coming to end of term, but we will go all the way to the end of term with colleagues, and then we'll spend the summer working on what this needs to look like. Really good suggestion that we think about what the strategy is going forward. You would expect us to say, of course, that is well and truly in hand, has been consulted with. The work of our high needs subcommittee, you are probably going to be the spotlight going forward, and have been actually historically, but going forward, the work of that committee and some of the decisions and options that we will need to consider need to be system-wide. So this isn't for me about NCC putting a raft of options on the table. This is about a collective partnership approach as to how we can consider what we do differently moving forward to meet the needs of many more children across Northumberland. And that was a focus before today, will be a focus tomorrow, and will definitely be a focus of the future. We will do that as well as wait, not necessarily wait, but wait for the publication to see what it tells us. I am not expecting that is going to give us the absolute answer to all of this. There is a significant financial impact nationally, and as David or Callum quite rightly said, we are very focused on the overspend at the moment, but it is not in the realms of some of the national overspend and some of our colleagues that we work with across the country. However, that doesn't mean we are resting on our laurels, and our High Needs Committee will have that focus, and I have asked David and team to make sure that committee is aware of just how much work we've got going ahead, and some of that difficult decision making that we may have to consider moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Audrey. Councillor Green.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Has there been any studies made to find out why there's such an increase in the requirement for SEND education in the past few years, and why it's likely to be increasing in the future?
Dave, do you want to take this one?
We obviously, there's a lot of review from a Northumberland perspective to try to work out why the growth has been as it has been. Our findings are compared to national findings, and we are very much in line with the national picture. The research that's available nationally tends to rotate around lasting impact from the pandemic. There's a number of reports which indicate possibly the use of social media. And there's also some reports which I would say possibly isn't a factor in Northumberland, which is about under fives, help for families collectively along to support young people to develop. I'm not personally, I'm not sure if there's a silver bullet. You can't say, oh, this is the cause and there we go. We do have a code of practice that's for special educational needs is very clear, and if there's a young person who there's a two-part test, it's statutorily we're obliged to complete the two-part test. We do complete the two-part test, and that in correctly applying the law has brought us to a position of the growth that we've got. But it would be probably fair to say that what looked typical across the school cohorts 5 or 6 years ago, we've probably seen the start of a growth at that point, is not the same, is not typical now. There are still lots of learners that are typical to previous, but we have a growing proportion of young people who do need something different, and special educational needs is a part of that, and we're working very hard collectively with our schools to deliver what the young people need so that they can go on to fulfilling and full engagement in their communities and ongoing employment, to be fair.
Thank you, David.
Keith?
Yeah, I'm co-chair of the county's largest special school, I believe. I'd say that the fundamental issue is the vast increase in EHCPs since they were introduced. And to the extent that I believe that our numbers, I was told last week, will be about 4 times what they were when I first started as a school governor. We await what the government will say in the white paper, but I can guarantee that there will be more money and it won't be enough, and that we will continue to have to seek to be able to provide more places by whatever means we find available to us. I'd say that probably one of the best ways of trying to minimise the number of EHCPs and the impact on the budget is to work on schemes to prevent students ending up in a special school. And I think that over the years Northumberland has been quite good at that, and that we're trying to explore other ways of doing that. And in particular, our Reconnect service at Collingwood is a means of trying to get students back into mainstream rather than to place them into special schools. Unfortunately, the funding for that is due to end at the end of the year, but we're hopeful that the combined authority will fund another year so we can expand the service and, if you like, mitigate the number of students who end up in special schools. So I'll just say that as an example, really, of the type of stuff that the County Council has done, really to try and mitigate the impact on the EHCP budgets. Thank you.
Thanks. I think that's an important point, that the outreach work that our special schools do to support colleagues in mainstream schools has become a really important part of their work. So it's not just about the learners they have within their own institutions, but it's the support and training they're able to offer in dealing with specialist conditions to keep those children in mainstream. I think that's important. We recognise that, Keith, so thank you for that. Any further questions? Okay, thank you very much. We'll move on to item 7, which is an information item, and it's maintained schools balances. Bruce.
Thanks, Chair. Obviously, hopefully everybody's had a chance to read the report. I'll not dwell on it. I'm conscious of time in terms of being at page 19 in your agenda pack. It's probably important at this point, though, just to demonstrate a golden thread in terms of, in the previous report, obviously Callum's demonstrated the one key issue in relation to the increasing high needs sort of overspend, essentially is the growth and plan numbers, which is in practice being facilitated an increase in the top-up spending as well. So we are sending this money sort of back to schools. The question is it enough? And looking at the overall position in terms of the school balances, obviously we've got a report that overall across the 100 Northumberland maintained schools, clearly we don't have access to the academy and multi-academy trust figures which sit outside of these figures. The balances fell by just short of £2 million in the financial year that ended March 2025. Again, that's a significant generalisation which will not reveal the movement in terms of individual balances between schools. We took a decision at Schools Forum some time ago that essentially at this point we don't publish individual school balances, but all school balances will be made available and are published by the DFE towards the end of the calendar year for the previous financial year. But it's important that rather than focusing on individual schools, we're bringing this report to Forum to give an overall flavour of the state of the financial nation, if you like. Clearly, we are working very closely with our maintained schools, where we identify those schools in deficit and at risk of going into deficit over the medium term, and work very closely to try to hopefully mitigate and pull that round. As you can see, there's a summary table essentially at the top of the second page of the report. And it's evident that essentially we saw a reduction in the cumulative balances across all phases and across all types of schools in terms of maintained schools in Northumberland. Ranging from 25% overall, but they range from sort of 10% from, albeit a very small sort of cohort of middle schools, to 44% in terms of our special schools. Now again, there may be reasons for that. There may be a question of some schools using balances to do capital development, to invest in IT infrastructure, and the such like in some individual circumstances. But nevertheless, I think the overall position just shows the financial pressure that schools, were under for the year ending 31st of March, and we know from the settlement we received for the 25-26 year will continue to be under for this year as well. There's a signpost there to the financial benchmarking and insights tool, should anybody want to pursue that further and look at individual school balances, though the balances in there at the moment just relate to the 23-24 year, both for maintained schools and academies alike. It can be a useful tool. But again, happy to take any questions on the paper at this point. Okay, great.
Just a question for me is what is your assessment of this picture? Clearly, it's a deteriorated picture from last year, and is that reflecting individual schools' reserves and not necessarily their in year? And what's your take as to how this is going to develop? Is it of significant concern, you would say, to us as a forum?
I think again, it's stating objectively, it's evident that a number of schools have had to draw down on reserves this year, but fundamentally it comes back to, and it's one I've used before in terms of, like it or not, education is very much a bums on seats business because of the nature, so much of the nature of funding being driven by pupils, and we've reported the Schools Forum previously, and we saw the impact on the schools grant overall for this year. That's the single major factor that we're facing, and we need to sort of, remodel on an individual school basis and structurally across Northumberland really to reflect that.
Thank you.
David?
Just in light of that, Graham, and it's a good question in terms of where we are going forward. I think we have looked at groups of schools to see whether there are any patterns across, is it all the small rural schools that are suddenly, is it the large secondaries that are doing well, is it special schools, is it what have you, there are examples of good outturns and not great outturns across all sectors, so it is quite difficult to pick. Usually they do come down to individual school cases, and the things that influence it, Bruce mentioned before, it could be that there's been large capital expenditure, which as a year one off, and that's fine, so you would expect a balance to drop in that particular position. Sometimes it's because it's a small school and 2 families have moved to Manchester, and that has a significant impact on the income for that school. For some schools, it's that they're in a position where maybe a lot of their staff are more experienced, which probably makes them a brilliant school and a great experience for the young people attending those schools, but they're super experienced, and that comes with a slightly higher price tag than others. So there's separate circumstances at the separate schools. Therefore, it's difficult to find immediate patterns, but when you put them all together, the pattern does seem to be a falling of those balances. I think the only is that historically, possibly Northumberland schools collectively, not individually, as I said, every school has its own cases. Historically, we've probably had quite strong balances. So whether this is a correction which will correct and then become sustainable would be everybody's hope, I'm sure. But everybody needs to have their regular and constant updates from a financial perspective and a really close insight supported by governors or trustees to really drill into what's happening at each individual school, because there's factors at each school which influence them strongly in one way or another.
Thanks, David. Any further questions on that item? Okay, if we can move on to item 8, one of the duties that all Schools Forum groups have is approving a scheme for financing maintained schools. There has been a consultation to all schools prior to this meeting. So Bruce, again, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Again, it's a standing item that comes to this meeting every year. We take on board the latest guidance from the DFE in terms of the revisions to the scheme for financing schools, and there's a very minor item amendment being made in relation to section 6.3 in relation to energy invoices, a clarification rather than a fundamental change further. Again, there is a link there in the report to directly to the DFE guidance. We're not proposing any fundamental changes to the scheme for financing schools on that basis. And again, the scheme for financing schools essentially lays out the relationship between the local authority and its maintained schools, within the context of other specific sort of guidance documents and regulations, such as in terms of the financial regulations. So on the basis of, other than the minor changes that have been amended and highlighted in the draft document that has been circulated, we do need Schools Forum specific approval to the scheme for financing maintained schools for the 25-26 academic year.
Before we move to approval, does anyone have any questions? Okay, in that event, is Schools Forum happy to approve the scheme as it is? Okay, thanks Bruce.
Thank you.
Okay, if we move on to item number 9 on the agenda, which is the work programme and the meeting dates for next academic year for Schools Forum.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Again, most of those dates should already be in your diary. I would like to highlight we're currently proposing Wednesday the 12th of November for the second meeting in the autumn term. The autumn term is always a heavy schedule in terms of the Schools Forum dates, with 2 dates in it. Latest guidance we've had from the DFE this in the last week or so has identified that we need to submit what's technically called a disapplication request, where we're essentially not directly applying school funding formula or school regulations to the DFE by the 17th of November. So, and again, in terms of what a disapplication request consists of, I'll highlight that in terms of, again, looking back through last year's papers, we've used disapplication requests very successfully in the past on a number of occasions to attract additional funding formula in when we've been faced with exceptional rent items. We've used it to, importantly, redistribute school funding when we've been dealing with reorganisations, phase 1 and phase 2 of reorganisations. So it is an important part of, again, the school financial regulations. So I'm proposing that we bring that date forward to the 12th of November, which would be ahead of that disapplication deadline. We already have a high needs committee scheduled for the 12th of November. So in practice, the Schools Forum will replace that. What we will do, again, in light of the anticipated white paper and further guidance, we will look to reschedule that High Needs Committee earlier, probably just before half term in October, which will essentially be around the. We'll confirm the date, but I'm thinking it would be around the 22nd of October, or 22nd or the week before, once we check across all of the school populations in terms of holidays. But with that amendment, if we can amend that date to the 12th of November, please, for the Schools Forum meeting, the list is otherwise accurate.
Thank you. Okay, item 10 is any other business. I haven't received notification of any items, which gives me an opportunity really just to say thanks to everyone for your work on Schools Forum as volunteers representing all schools on an advisory group to advise the local authority. Your work you do on behalf of colleagues is excellent, and I want to particularly thank Graham for chairing the High Needs Group, and all the officers of the local authority for their support, and particularly Bruce, Luke and Callum for the excellent work they do in preparing the agenda packs, which makes my job as chair very easy to have everything so well organised, so thank you. Okay, item 11, the date of the next meeting is Wednesday, the 1st of October, and it will be held via Teams. So thank you very much, and I hope everyone has a wonderful break over summer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.